Thank you for participating in today's meeting. Thank you for participating in today's meeting. If attending in person, please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room, and please silence all devices. If translation is provided, click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you're in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby or complete a blue speaker card as available. If you need assistance, please find a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items. Times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. More time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on making a public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
I'd call to order the Mobile Source Committee meeting for the month of February and ask for a roll call.
Supervisor Mitchell, she is absent. Supervisor Perez will be absent. Councilmember Rahman should be here, but running late. Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez, I think running late also. Chair Krakow, absent, and Acting Chair Mayor Pro Tem McKellen.
Thank you very much. The best committee is a committee of one, right? Today it is. We'll wait at least another minute to see if we get anybody else online. Otherwise, we'll begin since this is an information item and doesn't require any voting. So why don't we go ahead with the first item, the upcoming state implementation plan actions presented by Sang-Mi Lee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee and the public here. I'm Sang-Mi Lee. I'm Planning and Rules Manager presenting upcoming SIP actions. So the overall story of this presentation is we made progress in air quality, but we still do not meet multiple federal standards. And there are certain requirements set for non-attainment area and deadlines. And then we will walk you through those items in this presentation. So EPA set federal air quality standard and designate non-attainment area and defines requirements for non-attainment areas. The 2022 AQMD is the latest, the most comprehensive SIP documents we developed recently. This table lists the attainment status of South Coast and Coachella Valley for various federal standards. For ozone, South Coast is extreme non-attainment for all 4 standards, and Coachella met 2 out of the 4. For PM 2.5, South Coast met 3 standards out of 5, and Coachella is in attainment or unclassifiable for all PM 2.5 standards. Next one. So in terms of ozone levels, we all know we have made significant progress. However, the progress has been slowed down in recent years, partly due to adverse meteorology and complex ozone chemistry. But still good news is Coachella Valley continued its progress toward attainment, and there is a good news, which we'll discuss later of this presentation. Next slide. So this is the ozone levels in South Coast Basin demonstrating the significant progress in past almost a half of a decade in both 1 hour and 8 hour ozone. Next one. This is similar chart for Coachella. So the good remarks here is the red one representing 1 hour ozone is below the federal standard level showing in the black dashed line. And then 8 hour ozone in blue line is approach it, actually the one of the lines, that is 1997 8 hour ozone standard indicating it met it. Next one. PM 2.5 is driven by both direct PM emissions and then chemical formation in the atmosphere from its precursors. So progress in PM 2.5 in the basin is driven both by the reductions in direct PM emissions and then reductions in its precursors such as NOx. Next slide. So this is the PM 2.5 levels averaged over 24 hours in the past 24 years. The good news is the last bar presenting 2023 level is below the 35 microgram per meter cube, which is federal standard. And we maintained this level last year. That's our preliminary data indicates. Next slide. Annual PM 2.5 has a little bit more story. First, there is a progress, and then we met the one of the standard representing wet lines. And then we are getting very close to the second one and 12 microgram level. But then the latest one, 9 microgram, is still a little bit away, and we need more effort to meet it. Next one. So this presentation is going to have 8 different items, and we'll walk you through one by one. Next slide. The first one is 2027 AQMD, which is going to address the EPA's latest PM standard set last year. EPA promulgated a new standard at 9 micron per meter cube for annual average PM 2.5. EPA has till February next year to designate areas that do not meet the standard. And the non-attainment areas has to submit plan to EPA by fall 2027. Depending on the non-attainment status, we'll have either 2032 or 2036 to demonstrate the attainment. Next slide. So this new standard is fairly stringent, and it's going to be challenging to meet. With the NOx strategy to assist the ozone attainment, we'll certainly assist this standard as well. However, further controls on direct PM emission will be necessary. California expects 9 non-attainment areas for this standard more than ever. And then we are going to coordinate with other non-attainment areas and then state to come up with a certain the control measures targeting such as the commercial cookings or char broilers. The plot on the right indicating the major sources of direct PM emissions. It certainly shows commercial cooking being one of the largest source of emissions, followed by road dust and then residential fuel combustion. Next slide. Second item is following up of one of the PM plan we developed and adopted June last year. And we submitted this plan to EPA subsequently. And there are certain concerns related with this plan. First one is extension, the request to extend attainment date. So original attainment due is December this year, but we are not going to make it. So this extension of the attainment date, giving us more time, is critical. Second one is completeness determination. So there is an active sanction clock running associated with this plan due to failure to submit certain planning elements. EPA has to determine that SIP submitter from last summer is complete by August this year. Otherwise, the sanction can kick in. The last one is the reductions that were relied on attainment strategy. So CARB has a certain regulations submitted to EPA for its granting of waivers, but then there are some stories associated with it, and we'll discuss this item toward the end of this presentation. Next slide. This is a bit of good news. It is maintenance plan for 2006 PM 2.5 standard. So basin is currently serious non-attainment, but then EPA proposed initial determination that we met the standard last year. So we are going to request EPA to redesignate South Coast into attainment and then submit the maintenance plan. And we'll bring this to the board consideration later this year. Next slide. So this is also another good news. South Coast is maintenance area, or in other words, in attainment for PM10 standard. We developed a maintenance plan. Actually, this is second maintenance plan in year 2021. However, the plan is on hold due to EPA's request for additional monitoring. As of today, our preliminary data indicates we maintained the attainment level, so we are going to develop a second maintenance plan and submit to EPA. Next slide. So shifting topics a little bit to contingency measure, we discussed this multiple times last year. The contingency measure is a specific measure that if an area fails to attain the federal standard or fails to make progress toward attainment. So in principle, the contingency measure is designed to keep non-attainment area on track toward attainment. However, in practice, areas like South Coast with mature regulation doesn't really have opportunity to keep anything as a contingency. In fact, we use all feasible measures for attainment, not sparing any for contingency. Second, next slide. But in addition to that, there is very rigorous requirement contingency measure. First, it gotta have triggering mechanism, meaning that the measure needs to be already adopted and ready to go, ready to implement. Second, the contingency measure needs to take effect within 60 days and achieve reductions within up to 2 years from the triggering event. And then lastly, it requires to achieve a certain amount of emission reductions. It's defined as equivalent to 1 year's worth of progress. If you do not, you have to do very extensive and sometimes excruciating additional analysis to demonstrate that there is no other opportunity for contingency measure. Next slide. We're currently developing a SIP revision to address this contingency measure for ozone standard. We actually already amended multiple rules to incorporate this contingency provision into residential wood burning curtailment rules, and then leak detection and repair requirements at the refineries or chemical plants. California Resources Board has a smoke check contingency measure as well. However, the sum of all the reductions anticipated from these measures are less than the threshold amount. So we are currently going through this additional analysis demonstrating no further opportunities for contingency. We plan to bring this for board consideration summer this year. Next slide. This one is another contingency measure, but then to differentiate the previous one, this is commonly called the black box contingency measure plan. This is similar exercise or the project that was happened last year regarding one of the previous ozone standard. So the black box contingency is kind of a contingency to address the reductions associated with future cleaner technologies. Extreme non-attainment area like South Coast is allowed to rely on the future cleaner technology, and an attainment plan submitted to EPA has 97 tons of NOx reductions relying on future technologies. We have till December 2027 to identify these technologies and develop contingency and submit to EPA. Next slide. We all know that we failed. We did not meet the 99.7 ozone standard last year. EPA proposed a draft finding that we did not meet the standard last year, but as of today, they have not finalized it yet. Once they finalize it, we will have to trigger contingency measure, which is going to be expanding residential no-burn curtailment program. And we also need to trigger non-attainment fee for major stationary sources. Calculating in 2024, the dollar values, that is going to be $12,476 per ton of NOx and VOC exceeding baseline levels. Next slide. So this is another good news. As I mentioned previously, Coachella Valley met the 1997 8-hour ozone standard. However, it came 1 year later than original due date. So we submitted EPA extension of the attainment due by 1 year, which is allowed by Clean Air Act. The request is pending EPA's approval. Once EPA approves it, we are going to request to redesignate Coachella as attainment and also submit maintenance plan. So summarizing, next slide. So summarizing the timelines of these SIP actions. So South Coast ozone contingency summer this year, and then the redesignation request and maintenance plan for multiple PM standard for this year, and the potential revision to PM attainment plan to address some of the foregone emissions associated with the CARB's regulation, fall and winter this year. Next summer, we plan to submit the redesignation and the maintenance plan Coachella ozone. And then 2027 AQMD for new PM standard is going to be fall 2027, and December 27 is the contingency for ozone. Next one. We'd like to have your attention on sanctions a little bit. So sanction can be triggered if state fails to meet SIP commitment or fails to submit the SIP planning documents. Clean Air Act defines 2 types of sanctions. First one is a stationary source sanction, making new source become more expensive. And second one is the loss of federal freeway funding. The recent SIP revisions, such as that 2022 AQMD or the PM attainment plan, relies on reductions from CARB's regulation that were submitted to EPA for EPA's consideration of waivers. However, recently, CARB withdrew some of them, and then that leads to potentially foregone reductions, and then puts us theoretically at risk for sanctions. Next slide. These are the list of CARB's regulations that were recent regulations submitted for EPA's waiver. 4 of them were fully granted at the beginning of this year, 2 were partially granted, and 2 were withdrawn to avoid disapproval. And then the withdrawn regulations are in-use locomotive and advanced clean fleets, and there are quite sizable reductions associated with these 2 regulations. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, I didn't do. Sorry, I had it on my screen but didn't see it. So then go back to the 1 slide before. So these are the list of the regulations that CARB submitted and that they were either fully approved or partially approved or withdrawn. Next slide. And there are the reasonable further progress milestones defined for every 3 years. And the reductions associated with CARB's withdrawn regulations were relied on all these milestones and could affect the further progress for any of these milestones or all of these milestones. Next slide. So this is a summary slide. I will just put it up here, and for the sake of time, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sang-Mi. A good comprehensive presentation. Are there any questions or comments from committee members?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you. Appreciate the report. I'm happy to hold my questions until after public comment, though.
Okay. I'm seeing no other comments. We'll ask for public comment. If you wish to speak on this item, please raise your hand or punch *9 on your phone. We have one, Mike McCarthy.
Good morning, Mobile Source Committee members. Thank you for allowing me to speak, and thank you for staff for presenting that comprehensive overview. I've been an environmental consultant for 25 years. I have a PhD in atmospheric chemistry. I take two issues with the ozone characterization. Staff stated that ozone progress had slowed. That is not exactly true. In the last 15 years, ozone progress has stopped. It has stalled completely. We have made no progress in ozone since 2009 and possibly since 2004, depending on how you look at the figures. So I'd ask that any figures presented stop going back to 1980. We made most of our progress in the first 20 years, and we haven't made a lot of progress in the last 20. So please start showing what's been happening in the last 20 years, because we haven't been making much progress. And then a lot of the federal waivers for freight sectors, locomotives, trucks, have been withdrawn. They were a key part of the implementation plan. It is not clear that the air quality management plan to attain ozone can be met without them. It is time for South Coast to start advocating with SCAG and other local land use officials to stop the exponential growth in warehousing. Warehousing has been increasing by 5 times population growth for the last 20 years. It is part of the reason ozone progress has stopped. And that is because freight is more than 50% of the emissions of NOx into our basin. So we need to stop growing freight without consideration for its air quality impacts. And every single time that a warehouse is approved, they override. They use the significant and overriding considerations and say that the job and the economy is more important. So it's time to actually have South Coast lead and actually say that is not acceptable anymore, and to start deciding what the right size of warehousing is for a region in order to actually meet the standards, because we cannot count on the federal apparatus of state to technologically control the emissions out of the tailpipe. We have to control them from how many we're going to put on our roads. And that is something that is 100% within local land use officials' decision-making powers. And it is something that South Coast has to advocate for as a needed transportation demand measure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. We have no other public comment, so we'll close that and come back to the committee. Carlos, you had some comments?
Thank you. Yes. Just was curious if there could be further clarification on the nature of potential sanctions. You mentioned that in the presentation. Do we have a sense of what that might look like, both on the federal highway funding front and the new source review? Just trying to get a little more color on that. And then the second question I have is, how would the contingency measures, how does that align with our upcoming rulemaking, and how does that influence the overall goals that we would be attempting to reach in light of the, as you said, more stringent levels adopted last year by EPA? I'm just trying to reconcile those, the goals set by EPA that are more stringent, our efforts to meet those by way of contingency measures, and then how does that impact our upcoming rulemaking schedule as far as upcoming items that we'll be looking at? Thank you for clarifying those two questions.
Staff response, there's a lot of question there.
There was a lot of question there, but happy to give it a crack, and maybe we can follow up with some clarification. So on the sanctions, a couple of sanctions can kick in. Like we have offsets, which affects permitting. So then we would go to 2-for-1 offsets, which makes permitting a lot harder. There are the threat of withdrawing federal highway funds, which are very significant in our region. I think the last time we took a look at this, it was in the figure of like $27 billion that could be at risk. So there are some exceptions for safety and transit projects, but it is a pretty big threat. And then the federal takeover of air quality planning. So those federal implementation plans where, previously, and this many years ago when we were facing that risk here at South Coast, EPA had proposed a fairly draconian plan that had things like limiting air traffic, limiting cargo at our ports, et cetera. So those are, fairly draconian and pretty severe, but those are the types of sanctions that we could be looking at. Obviously, we would continue to work with EPA and see, if we are facing that, see what we could do about it. I'm a little confused on your question on contingency. The contingency measures that Sang-Mi was discussing they're more administrative requirements where we have to get, go through some exercise to EPA to show that we can get either some additional emission reductions when we trigger these milestones, or go through the analysis showing that we've done everything we possibly can and it's infeasible. So that's a little different than the requirements we're going to have to go through in terms of showing how we meet the new PM standard, for example. It's more of a bureaucratic exercise.
And the sanction clocks are different for each one of those.
That's correct,
right?
yes.
And what are they?
So you have well, there's many sanction clocks that Dr. Lee described, but when you hit a sanction clock, the first time period is 18 months, and then the second is 24 months for the second series of sanctions to hit.
Any further questions?
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to understand that the reference to the $27 billion in potential sanctions. Have we examined that implication to SCAG's Connect SoCal plan, or what that might look like? Have they given us input on that? And this aside from that, which obviously that tremendous amount, I'm just again wanting to understand how does this report, in your view, impact our upcoming rulemaking, whether it's looking at matters related to, well, just generally speaking, do we see that? Trying to reconcile the report with how we're tying that into our upcoming efforts on the rulemaking calendar, and some examples of you mentioned permitting could be more difficult. That's aside from it's not business as usual. So I'm just trying to absorb this report, but say, okay, well, what does that mean for us moving forward? I understand it's a very good report, but so as we pivot to the rulemaking, what are the implications?
Maybe I could answer that, and Dr. Reese can provide some additional information if I leave anything out. I think it's important to note, board member, that the Clean Air Act requires us to undertake all feasible measures. And so right now we're looking at, as we develop our rulemaking calendar, we're looking at the emission reductions that we can achieve. What happened with California's withdrawal of the waivers or the disapproval of the waivers is it puts a greater burden on us to make up that shortfall. And so right now we're in discussions with CARB and with EPA on how are we going to address this, because there's clearly only so much that we can do. And so we continue on to do all feasible measures. We continue to have discussions to see what CARB can do to address some of the emissions under their controls. And in the meantime, as Dr. Reese had alluded to, there's almost always a sanctions clock at some point in time. We're dealing with some of those now. Usually we're able to develop a plan to address that, whether it's to extend it or to revise it. Those are the things that we do every day. And those are the things that we bring for your consideration, whether it's a contingency measure that kicks in because the emissions have exceeded a certain value. All of these are the things that we bring to you. So I hope I've answered your question in terms of what are we doing about the EPA's denial of our various plans or our failure to meet attainment, we submit revised plans. Those plans get reviewed and approved. That will generally stop a sanctions clock. If there's something more, as Dr. Reese said, we've got 18 months and then we've got another 24 months to try to correct the records. Hopefully that helps.
Those sanction clocks are ticking now, the 18 months that you referenced?
So yes,
Okay.
the first one is to get the revised plan. And that's what we'll be bringing back to you probably August. Yeah. We have many that we'll be bringing to you in the next several months. I'll leave it at that.
And resubmitting the plan will stop the sanction clock.
That's correct.
Okay.
Could you tell Mojave that?
I think we did.
Sorry, sorry, Wayne, I missed that. What are you going to be bringing many of to the board in the coming months?
So we have a series of rules we're going to be bringing over the summer, and these are part of what we need to do for our PM plan as a most stringent measure requirement. So it's relatively minor rules. It's just to make sure that our rules are the most stringent, as its name suggests, but those are part of the SIP requirement.
Got it. Thank you. I had another question, but don't want to interrupt you, Carlos.
No, go right ahead.
Go ahead, Councilmember Rahman.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I just had not two questions. One is about the black box measures that were included in our 2022 AQMP. In the 2 years that have passed, 3 years, I guess now, that have passed since then, are we able to shed light on more of what those black box measures are? Have we seen technological improvements that have helped us to address the shortfall that we put into the plan with the black box measures?
Yeah, so, I think technology is still marching forward, but as you note, we did have a fairly significant black box associated with that plan. And a lot of that really was looking at those federal sources of emissions, which, as we've discussed, we have limited regulatory authority over. It's, at this point with the new administration, to say that it's unclear what we can expect in terms of further reductions from those sources, I think is an understatement. But we'll continue to work and to highlight the need to take reductions for those categories.
Right. And the locomotives rule or our rail yards ISR, the fact that CARB has withdrawn the waiver request for the locomotive and ACF rules. I know that that's going to have a big impact on our rail yards ISR because it was really dependent on that. How do we think about that in the context of this discussion? Do we go back to that rule, or are we just, kind of how do we grapple with that?
So we're actually in discussions with CARB now, and that's part of what I had said earlier, is that with CARB's withdrawal of the various waivers and with EPA reconsidering those, that addresses, I should say that creates an even larger shortfall for us. So we want to work with CARB to identify what can they do. And then we also want to work with EPA to see what EPA can actually do.
With them withdrawing those waiver requests, what can CARB do at this point? I mean, didn't they already do what they could and then with the administration change pulled back?
They pulled back, but that doesn't mean that they can't reconsider and look at something else. And that's what we're in the process of trying to do, is trying to be realistic about what are some of the other things that they might be able to do. And so we're in discussions on those. We will come back to the board with, what our conclusions are after we've had those discussions. But I don't anticipate that to be for a few months at least.
And that might result in amendments to our rule?
It might.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Well, the CARB rules, other parts of the CARB rules are still in effect, only the ones that require waiver of those included in those rules have been, in essence, done away with. Is that correct?
So for some of there was a table that we showed with a whole variety of rules. The ones that have gotten a waiver or partial waivers, yes, those go into effect. For the two rules, ACF and the in-use locomotive rule, there's also ongoing litigation on those, and I think that also has to be resolved to see what the final conclusion is for any parts of those rules where the litigation applies.
Yeah, but there are parts of those rules that don't require a waiver. Is that correct?
I would defer to CARB on this, but there is ongoing litigation on that.
For instance, on the in-use locomotive rule, the
Correct.
passenger rail in California still has the requirements included from that rule. Correct?
I don't believe so, Mayor.
Why not? Because they have nothing to do with anything outside of California. We're talking
I
about
think that-
commuter rail,
I think that's still, I'm sorry,
talking about
passenger rail?
passenger rail in California. The commuter rail, passenger rail, like Metrolink.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think the best thing for us to do is to sit down with CARB and to come back and answer that question. I think we have some question, so let us get back with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little uncertain right now, and because of the waivers being pulled back. On the question, I have just an observation. The ozone, the NOx levels have been going down over the years. But looking at the 3-year average of the fourth highest 8-hour reading of ozone, it's been sort of flat, even though the NOx has been going down. And during the period of 2016 to 2022, it actually increased. And I brought it up before, why is we're bringing the NOx down, but the ozone levels aren't coming down?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right. I'm like, NOx has been going down, and we've been seeing ozone levels either flatline or in some cases go up. What we're seeing, we're in the phase of the atmospheric chemistry where we still need a lot more NOx reductions to sort of break through that ridge of what we're seeing, that balance between NOx and VOC and ozone. So we need to take much further reductions in order to move over that hump. And then we're also seeing the impacts of weather, where we're very weather dependent, and when we have summers where a lot of warm temperatures, stagnant conditions, very conducive to ozone formation, and that's really driving a lot of what we're seeing over the last few years. Dr. Lee, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
I think you've mentioned it very well. Thank you.
Does some of it have to do with the oscillation of the Pacific high out there in the ocean? Comes in and out, in and out.
That will certainly impact the weather patterns that we see that are conducive to ozone formation. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions, comments from the committee members?
One other question.
Go ahead, Carlos.
The recent fires, how will that be taken into account regarding future reporting?
Yeah, those are fires, to the extent that we had exceedances associated with that, those would be classified as exceptional events. And so we would go through that analysis with EPA and then get those exceedances taken out of the consideration for the standard.
And then, Wayne, I'm just wondering how you would characterize in general, in the past, it's been mentioned if we did everything in our power, there's a dilemma of still not reaching compliance because of some of the, we need everyone to be pulling in the same direction, and some of the things that we don't have control over the ships in the ports and other things that are under federal jurisdiction, and the lack of action there not resulting in us maximizing our full level of collective emissions. Yet we seemingly are penalized for that. Can you just maybe summarize that in your perspective? So you're just going to have a reset of that dilemma.
So the primary issue, I think has been said a little bit earlier, is those federal sources, planes, trains, trucks, ships. And part of what had been discussed with EPA was greater involvement in addressing emissions of those sources. I think, you know, with the new administration, there's a period of assessment in terms of what it is that they're going to do. So we have a number of different avenues before us, and we're trying to pursue as aggressively as we can all of those avenues. So one is obviously trying to get EPA to become more aggressive in regulating those sources so that the burden doesn't fall on us and our sources, which are already some of the cleanest sources when we look out at what has been done, certainly throughout the state and the nation. The other aspect is the Clean Air Act. We've talked about working with Congress, working with the administration. I believe that the original 1990 amendments recognizes that local areas were not meant to be punished for things that happened that were beyond their control. And yet that is the condition that we're facing. So that in part is one of the things that we hope to be talking to Congress about. You know, there's always been a discussion over the last few decades about what does the Clean Air Act do, and in fact, does it need to be addressed? There's already discussions going on about new source review, about review periods. So we're going to pursue all avenues, including looking at the Clean Air Act and seeing what can be done on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, we'll move on to our written reports. We have 3 written reports. Anyone want to discuss those? I have an observation and question of Ian on the WARE report. I listened in on one of the workshops a couple days ago, and you presented the fact that we've collected 42 million in litigation money, and that we're beginning to solicit, if you will, the fact that that money's available, and are there any projects that it could be used on, et cetera, back to source, et cetera. It seems to be that we're getting a lot of mitigation funds. How much actual reductions in criteria pollutants have we received so far?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So looking apart from the mitigation fees, just on the actions that warehouse operators are taking, we presented in the annual report last fall that we thought there was about just shy of 1 ton per day of NOx reductions from the rule, and the rule is still being phased in. It's a 5-year phase-in period. That was through the first 2 years. So we are expecting that we'll eventually get to somewhere between 1.5 to 3 tons per day of additional emission reductions from that rule. The mitigation fees in that program would be additional to that. So anything would be additional to that. And if I can add the one extra point here, the mitigation fees so far are a very small percentage of the actions that are being taken from warehouse operators. It's single-digit percent, 3%, 5%, somewhere around there.
Thank you. Committee members, seeing no other action on these written reports, I'll ask for public comment. Is there anyone in the public who wishes to speak on these 3 written reports? We have one hand up, Mike McCarthy. I think you've used your, is it 3 minutes for all items?
It is, I believe he has 35 seconds left though, Mayor.
Mike, you have 35 seconds left. Go ahead. Mike, if you wish to use your 35 seconds, unmute. If not, we'll move on.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I would just, again, thank you for allowing me to speak for 30 seconds. Warehousing is growing at 12 to 1,400 acres per year. It is growing at 4 times population growth. We are choosing to grow this, and it is something under state and local control. It is something we can change. And I'd just like to ask, the compliance rate is something between 30 and 40% for the warehouse reporting rule. I really would like to know a little bit more about what that means in terms of the actual enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Now we'll go on to any other business, committee members? Seeing none,
None here. Thank you.
we'll go on to general public comment. Public comment on items not on the agenda, but within the purview of this committee. If you have any, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we will then adjourn our meeting, and our next meeting will be on March 21st at 9 a.m.
All right.
Thank you for being here.
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Mayor.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you.